Hey everyone, I'm Ellie's Zone, and you're tuned in to our webinar on everything you need to know about LCL shipping. This is an especially important subject matter with Chinese New Year coming up on January 25th. So let's just jump into it. So our agenda for the day really calls for first understanding how LCL works, then deciding if LCL is right for you, and then finally how to get the best LCL pricing. But first, here's a quick refresher or intro for those of you unfamiliar with Freightos. Freightos is the world's largest online freight marketplace, and we help thousands of importers like you compare, book, and manage freight across over 75 providers. We help you navigate pricing with real visibility into the current market, manage all of your shipments and billing on one platform, and round that off with some great technology and human support. If you haven't already, you can sign up for free at freightos.com. Now I'd like to introduce my colleague, Devora Wolf. She works here as a freight content specialist, and she knows just about everything about LCL. So go for it.
Thanks, Ellie. So, as Ellie said, we're going to be talking about LCL today, what it is, how it works, how to decide if it's the right shipping mode for you, and how to make sure you're getting the best pricing possible. And as Ellie mentioned, this is very important to cover before Chinese New Year. There's our beautiful Chinese New Year graphic, which is going to shut down ports essentially in late January in mainland China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. So important to start thinking about getting your shipments out now. Okay, so what is LCL? LCL stands for less than a container load, which means any shipment that is too small to fill a full 20-foot or 40-foot shipping container. Right, so if you wanted a full container, if you had a larger load, that would be a full FCL, a full container load. Here's why LCL is important. First of all, container trade is growing, and it's expected to grow by almost 5% every year through 2025. So LCL as a part of container shipping is an important part of that. And LCL itself is important too. Right, LCL it increased by nearly 10% in 2018, and that's due to a variety of reasons. One is more frequent shipping. A lot of shippers are shipping smaller shipments, more particular shipments more frequently. One is the rise of e-commerce in general. One is the fact that there's more trade lanes, there's more visibility into trade lanes. Essentially, shipping has become more accessible, so a lot more people are doing it. So as a result, we're seeing growth in LCL, and we hope to see you guys get involved in that too. So here's something important to know about LCL, and this is basically a unique feature, and that is that it requires loading and unloading. So as opposed to FCL, where your goods are basically sealed at the factory and not unsealed until they reach your destination warehouse, LCL goods need to be loaded onto containers together with other shipments. This is also why LCL is sometimes called groupage, right? Shipments are grouped together. And because LCL needs to be loaded and unloaded, that affects pricing, that affects transit time, that affects the amount of handling that's involved, and we're going to talk about all of these as we go through the webinar. So here are some of the benefits of shipping LCL. The first benefit is that you're going to save money on a smaller shipment. Right, if you don't have enough to fill a full container, then paying a flat fee for a full container load is not going to be worth it for you. You pay for the space that you need with LCL, no more, no less, and it can be really economical for those who have smaller shipments. The other thing is that because you have a smaller shipment, you're probably going to save on inventory costs, right? Less stuff being shipped, less stuff needs to be stored in a warehouse, right? So you'll save on inventory costs, and a lot of shippers find that that's a good system for them to ship more shipments more frequently. Another thing is that you'll avoid high air freight prices. Many shippers with smaller shipments need to decide between air freight and LCL, which we'll talk about a little more in depth. But air freight tends to be much more expensive, so by shipping LCL, you'll save a lot of money. The other thing is that during peak season, right, during sort of the August to October peak shipping season by sea, a lot of times FCL container space gets filled up very quickly. So if you have a smaller shipment, an LCL shipment, it can be easier to find space during that crunch time and sort of get it on whatever ship has space, whatever container has space, that is. Okay, of course there are drawbacks as well to any mode that you might choose. So some of the drawbacks to shipping LCL are, first of all, it takes a little bit longer than FCL. And this is, as we said, because of the loading and unloading, right? It takes a little bit of time to load the shipment onto a container at the origin port and a little bit of time to unload it. So that's usually going to add a few days to your transit time. The second thing is that LCL actually costs more per unit than FCL. And when we say per unit, we usually mean cubic meter. Per cubic meter, an LCL shipment is more expensive. And that's why the larger your shipment gets, the more it makes sense to start considering whether FCL is actually worth it for you. We'll talk more about that later as well. Another thing is that since your shipment is grouped together with other shipments, if there are delays with other shipments, right, any number of things can happen, whether it's weather related, whether it's something happens at the port, like incorrect paperwork, incorrect classification. If that happens to one of the shipments on your shipment's container, it might affect your shipment as well and cause delays. And the last thing is that there's more potential for damage. Whenever something is handled more, the opportunity for damage is higher. So because of the loading and unloading, there's just more interaction with your goods, which means the potential for damage is a little higher. Okay, so how much does LCL shipping cost? So the first thing to know is that LCL shipment costs are determined by size, by volume, and by weight. So that's usually by cubic meter and by kilogram. And your shipment is going to be priced according to those factors. In your quote, you will often see the costs broken down into the following pieces. The first is the pickup charges, and that is the charges of getting your goods from the warehouse to the port. Then there are the origin charges. This is the charge of putting your goods onto that container. That's sometimes called stuffing also. So getting it actually requires a lot of work, a lot of people, a lot of machines, cranes to load your good onto the container. Then there's the ocean freight, which is the main leg of the journey by sea, right? Getting your goods actually from point A to point B. Then there's the destination charges, which are the unloading from the container, right? Taking it off of the container, separating it back into your shipment. And then there are the charges of getting your goods from the port to your destination warehouse. So something to know is that even though the ocean freight is obviously an extremely important part of the journey, that's not always going to be the most expensive part of the cost. Often the origin and destination charges for LCL are quite a significant part of the overall cost, and that's because, as we mentioned, of all the work that needs to go into loading and unloading your goods from the container. So here are some other charges to take into account. One is if you're an Amazon shipper, you're going to need to label and palletize your goods. That can add some extra charges. And one thing that we recommend doing is talking to your supplier and seeing if they can do the labeling and palletizing at the factory. That'll usually save you money as long as your supplier is fully aware of all of those requirements. Another thing to take into account is the duties and taxes. Sometimes people are surprised by how significant these charges can be to their overall business expenses. So it's a good idea to estimate them in advance. You can estimate them on Freightos. There are other tools you can use to estimate how much you're going to owe at customs. And that's sort of an important thing to try to know in advance if you can. And the last thing is insurance. You're going to need to get insurance for your goods and factor that in as well. How long does LCL shipping take? Well, of course, it's going to depend on how large your shipment is, what your origin and destination is. But typically, in a shipment from China to the U.S., which is a very popular route for Freightos customers, it's going to take around 4 to 6 weeks door to door, and that means all the way from your factory to the destination warehouse. Okay, so we've now talked about what LCL is and how it works and how the pricing works, basically. So now we're going to get into how you decide whether this is the right mode for you. And first we're going to look at this in terms of LCL versus air, which is a decision that a lot of smaller shippers need to make, right? They have something on the smaller ends. Just for reference, at Freightos, we typically see LCL shipments of around 1,000 kilograms and 5 cubic meters. So a lot of times people will be deciding between LCL and air. And the main factors are that LCL is much cheaper and air is much faster. So you're going to want to be weighing those options against each other, and we'll take an example to sort of illustrate that. This is a hockey puck. This is for all the Canadians out there who I think loving hockey is a citizenship requirement. I'm not Canadian, but I'm Midwestern, so we share a lot of characteristics. Apologizing too much, that sort of thing. Okay, so let's say you have a shipment of 500 hockey pucks that you need to get from Shanghai to LA. Okay, so your 500 hockey puck shipment is about 0.06 cubic meters and 85 kilograms. By LCL, that's going to cost you $400. By air, it'll cost $600. Okay, so let's say you double that to 1,000 hockey. I see here we tripled it, but let's say you doubled it from 500 to 1,000 hockey pucks, which means doubling your weight, doubling your size. LCL is $475 on the rates that we ran. We ran these rates on Freightos, and air jumps to $900, right? So a small jump for LCL, a bigger jump for air. And if you double it again to 2,000, you now the LCL rate actually stays the same at $475, but air jumps all the way up to $1,570. So let's look at these mapped out on a chart. Okay, so your smaller shipment, you have a difference of $200, right? So it's somewhat significant, but if you needed your goods very, very quickly, you might consider that $200 difference to be worth it. And actually, we ran these rates during peak season for air. So if in a different time of year, not November, December, it could be that an air shipment of this size would actually be the same as an LCL shipment, or maybe even cheaper in some cases. Here, the difference is $200. Now, if you increase to 170 kilograms, the difference is close to double on air. And if you increase again to 2,000, now your air rates is more than triple. Okay, so that's a very significant difference. So as you see, the weight increase really makes a big difference by air, and that's something that's going to be important. The larger your shipment gets, the more economical it's going to be to ship by sea. Now, if you need your goods ASAP, it's not going to matter, right? If you have something like a Halloween store and you need to get your costumes in, it's not useful for you to get them in November or December. You must get them in. So it's going to be worth it sort of no matter what the cost difference is to pay for air. But if you're able to plan that in advance and get that shipment out in July or August, you're going to save a lot of money. Okay, so here's a few other things to know when you're deciding between LCL and air. One is for LCL, because there's so much more space when you're shipping by sea, the minimum that a freight forwarder is sort of going to charge you for is a cubic meter. That means if your shipment is smaller than that, it's not going to cost you less. Weight is very important for air. Weight differences are going to cause the prices to jump very, very rapidly on air. When it comes to LCL, the volume is more important. And what that really means is that for heavier shipments, it's always going to be more economical to ship by LCL. The other thing to know is that destination is going to make a difference for LCL, but much less so for air. So for example, if, again, I have a shipment from Shanghai, to ship it to LA or to ship it to New York by air is not going to make a big difference. But if I ship by LCL, it will make a difference. That's because the route is different, so that's going to affect transit time. It will affect pricing, right? So that's going to make a difference on LCL, but not so much on air. So let's say your shipment is a little bigger, and now your decision is not between LCL and air, but between LCL and FCL. And as we mentioned, there are times when it's worth it for you to get a full container, even if your goods don't actually fill that entire container. So that's because, as we said, the cost per cubic meter for LCL is higher. So let's do a little comparison. So if you look at the blue box, the first blue box from the left, we ran a rate for a 5 cubic meter shipment, and that came out to $800. Double that to 10 cubic meters, it's now $1,200, and triple it to 15 cubic meters, it's now $2,000. But the thing to note is that an FCL, a full 20-foot container, is also $2,000. So once you hit that 15 cubic meter mark, it actually is worth it to get the full container. And the important thing to note here is that a full container, a full 20-foot container, is actually capable of holding 33 cubic meters. So even though the 15 cubic meter is less than half of that, it still costs the same as FCL. And why would it be worth it for you to do that? As we said, FCL shipments usually get there a little faster. They have less potential for damage, right? So that's going to be worth it for you to consider. The one caveat to that is that if you're an Amazon shipper, sometimes it's hard to get an appointment at your warehouse to deliver a full container, and it's easier to get an appointment for a smaller shipment, an LCL shipment. So if you end up saving money on an FCL, you might end up paying more in storage charges waiting for your appointment. So if you're an Amazon shipper, that's just something to take into account when you're making that decision. Okay, so now we've talked about what LCL is, how it works. We've talked about factors in deciding whether it's right for you. And now we're going to talk about how to get the best pricing on LCL or how to become an LCL superhero. The first thing is you're going to want to get multiple freight quotes. So that means requesting quotes from multiple forwarders, not just using the first quote you get. And the reason you want to do this is really for two reasons. The first is that when you have multiple quotes, you'll obviously be able to choose the best price. But the other thing that it does is that when you have a variety of quotes to choose from, you'll be able to see sort of what the normal expected market rate is. And then you'll be able to see if your quote is too high or too low and if it just doesn't make sense. And as we'll see, having a quote that's too low can sometimes be a problem. We'll get into that in one of the next tips, but it's not always a good thing. So you want to make sure that the quotes that you're getting match the market rates. The second thing is to know your pallet dimensions. So boxes are stacked in pallets on a container, and that keeps them safe. It keeps them sort of uniform so that they're easy to pack and unpack. And when you get your dimensions from your supplier, they'll always tell you the box dimensions, but sometimes they won't tell you the pallets unless you ask. And the reason you want to know your pallet dimensions is that they add a little space to your shipment, and that space you're going to have to pay for. So make sure you ask for those pallet dimensions so that you can know your full charges in advance. The next thing is if you have fragile goods, understand that you'll probably have to pay for more space. So as we said, LCL shipments are pallets stacked on top of each other in the container. But if you have a flat screen TV shipment, you're not going to want anything stacked on top of that, right? So that means that when you have a fragile shipment, fewer things can be stacked along with it. And that means that you'll have to pay for more space. So that's something to take into account. Okay, so let's go back to our freight quote that was too low. Okay, why would that be a problem? Sometimes when you talk to a freight forwarder and you get a quote that's very low, it could be that there is less service provided, right? So if you're expecting service all the way to your factory, but the quote actually only takes your goods to the port and you need to arrange for shipment to the factory separately, you could end up with extra charges that you weren't anticipating. So what we would advise you to do is when you're talking to your freight forwarder, make sure to book service all the way to your destination warehouse. What that will do is get all your charges laid out in advance. You'll be able to check them. You'll be able to see if that makes sense, and you won't get hit with surprises down the road. Okay, number 5, know your interior container dimensions, right? So a 20-foot container, make sure you know what it actually contains on the inside, so that you can decide how much space you really need, how much of the container you fill, and then you'll be able to decide better what's worth it for you, LCL or FCL. Number 6, get a handle on Amazon warehouse guidelines. So Amazon warehouse guidelines can be very, very strict. As we mentioned, it's sometimes possible to get some of those requirements taken care of at the factory by your supplier, so that's a really good idea. And anytime you sort of know and are clear on what's expected, you'll be able to avoid getting hit with sort of surprise fees down the road to hit those guidelines. So those are our tips for getting the best pricing for LCL, having covered sort of what LCL is, how to decide, how to become an expert superhero, and now we will take questions.
Okay, great. So the first audience question is LCL affected by peak season?
This is a great question. FCL is affected by peak season and so is air, but LCL actually isn't really. And that's because the actual ocean freight part of the journey is not as significant for LCL, and so it's less susceptible to the fluctuations in shipping rates. So you don't really have to worry too much about peak season when it comes to LCL, which is a nice thing.
How do I track my LCL shipment?
So tracking your shipment, a lot of times you can do this with your freight forwarder or directly with the carrier. They'll let you do it online. If you use Freightos, you can track it through us. So it's getting easier and easier to do that.
Okay, so we're just about out of time. And just as a reminder, if you want to get started comparing rates and getting ready to get your LCL shipments out before Chinese New Year, you can just head on over to ship.freightos.com and get started right away. Just keep in mind to select boxes and pallets for your search. And as always, if you have any questions, you can chat with a Freightos rep live on the site. Thanks to Dvora for walking us through this today, and to everyone for coming. We hope to see you at the next one. Have a good day.